Here
Hart missed the beat over 10.
are crazy things F1 used to do. At number 1. The Indy 500 is one of the oldest and most prestigious races ever, now part of the IndyCar series. But get this, back in the 1950s, it was also part of Formula 1. Back then, the Indy 500 had its own set of rules, and it was mostly American teams and drivers in the mix, with a few Formula 1 drivers giving it a shot. F1 drivers and teams had to jet over to America and adapt to the Indy 500 rules, so not many bothered since it was a pretty penny for just one race. This setup meant that if you did well in the Indy 500, you could actually beat some Formula 1 drivers in the overall standings. Take Roger Ward for example. He won the Indy 500 in 1959, scoring 8 points, and even beating Graham Hill, who raced in 7 Formula 1 events that season. But as both series became more professional, the Indy 500 parted ways with Formula 1. Coming in at number 2. The helmet is one of the most essential elements when it comes to safety, and no one disputes that. But funnily enough, it wasn't always like that. When Formula 1 kicked off as a championship back in 1950 till 1952, helmets weren't even required. Drivers just rocked leather caps and goggles, and only later, when they made it a must, they switched to cork-based helmets. Eventually, those helmets got upgraded to full-face ones with visors, but guess what? Some Formula 1 drivers weren't too keen at first. They worried the visors would fog up and not let enough air in during those scorching hot races. With time and safety getting better, you can't even think about racing without helmets. Time for number 3. Formula 1 and Formula 2 have their own set of rules, laying down the law for the pinnacle of motorsport and its feeder series. But back in the day, in 1952 and 1953, things got a bit hairy. In 1952, Alfa Romeo had to tap out because they couldn't rustle up cash for a new car. Meanwhile, BRM was all set with 2 V16-powered cars but pulled out last minute, leaving Ferrari as the lone serious contender in Formula 1. So, the World Championship organizers had to improvise and run the races with Formula 2 cars instead. These cars had 2-liter naturally aspirated engines, giving a bit more variety to the mix. But surprise, surprise, Ferrari still swept all the races, with Alberto Ascari taking the championship. They kept those rules in 1953, and guess what? Ascari and Ferrari kept on dominating until 1954, when they brought back Formula 1 regulations. And with that, Mercedes jumped into the championship scene. Number 4 takes us back to the 50s, where it was pretty common to see drivers sharing cars. Why? Well, races were longer, tracks were rougher, and cars weren't exactly the most reliable, so you had loads of retirements. When the lead driver of a team retired from a race, he would start sharing the car with a slower teammate to improve the result. Can you imagine that happening today? It's wild. Sometimes conditions were so brutal, like scorching heat, that drivers needed a breather. That's when they swapped seats mid-race. Take the 1955 Argentine Grand Prix for instance. Both Nino Farina and Maurice Trintignant scored 2nd and 3rd place by sharing a ride. And get this, when 2 drivers shared a car, they split the points evenly. There were even 3 times when the winner shared a car, with the last one being in the 1957 British GP, when Sterling Moss and Tony Brooks shared the victory. They put the brakes on this whole car sharing thing in 1958, but in the 60s it popped up every now and then. The last time it happened was in the 1964 US Grand Prix with Mike Spence and Jim Clark. Crazy, right? At number 5, we see some unfair competition. Nowadays, Formula 1 and Formula 2 might share a few races in the calendar, but they do their own thing. Different rules, different weekend setups, the works. But back in the 1950s and 1960s, things were a bit more mixed up. Sometimes they'd throw both Formula 1 and Formula 2 cars onto the same track. It worked best on really long circuits where the performance gap between the cars wasn't a big deal. One of those tracks was the Nürburgring Nordschleife. In the 1967 German Grand Prix, Jackie Ickx rocked up in third place during qualifying with a Formula 2 car, beating out a bunch of Formula 1 cars. But on race day, he had to start behind them to avoid causing a ruckus. Still, 3 Formula 2 cars managed to crack the top 10, leaving some Formula 1 drivers in the dust, with Jackie Oliver finishing 5th. Wild times, huh? At number 6, we see that 2 drivers wasn't the norm. Back in the early days of Formula 1, teams could basically throw in as many drivers as they pleased, or as many as they could afford, really. There weren't that many teams around, and some were pretty small time, only showing up for a handful of races. You even had drivers buying cars from one brand and racing under that manufacturer. But as Formula 1 became more professional, costs shot up and more teams joined the fray, they started cutting back on the driver count. By the 70s, it was pretty standard to see just 2 drivers per race. The last time a team raced with more than 2 drivers was at the 1985 German Grand Prix, when Francois Hinault hopped into a 3rd Renault. Nowadays, the rules only allow 2 drivers per team per race, so you won't catch any team fielding more than that. Number 7 has to go to some of the old tracks. Right now, tracks got to ace those top-notch safety tests to even make it onto the F1 calendar. But back in the day, oh boy, it was a whole different ball game. Most races went down on road and street courses with only a handful of permanent tracks, often repurposed old airfields. And let me tell you, those tracks were bonkers. Fast roads with bumps, twists, and hardly any safety barriers. Take the Pescara circuit for instance. It was the longest track ever at a whopping 25.8 kilometers and ridiculously fast. Even Enzo Ferrari himself said, "Nope, not sending my cars there." Then you had circuits like Bremgarten, Eindhoven or Sherrard, all on public roads. Super fast, full of ups and downs and 0 barriers on the sides. And don't even get me started on the Aarhus circuit. Just 2 massive straights on an autobahn with a crazy bank turn and no barrier up top. With tracks like these, it's no wonder fatal accidents were all too common. And it wasn't just the drivers at risk. Sometimes unlucky spectators found themselves in harm's way as cars went flying off the track and plowed right into them. Number 8 asks the question, seatbelts, what are those? Just like helmets, another thing everyone agrees is super crucial nowadays is the seat belt. Whether you're racing or just cruising around town, buckling up is non-negotiable. It's literally a lifesaver, no doubt about it. But back in the day, seat belts weren't as universally embraced, especially in Formula 1. Lots of drivers chose to go without them. This meant that many of them, when they had a bad crash, it often ended in disaster. They'd get thrown out of the car, getting seriously hurt or worse. When asked about it, drivers back then had this tough guy attitude, saying they'd rather be killed outright or thrown clear than be stuck in a burning wreck. But in 1968, the FIA stepped in, recommending seat harnesses. And by 1972, 6-point harnesses became mandatory. Since then, there's been no question about it. Seatbelts save lives, plain and simple. At number 9, we have a regular guest of modern GPs. Believe it or not, the safety car is a pretty recent addition to Formula 1. It officially joined the party in 1993 after some trial runs at the 1992 French and British Grand Prix. But get this, the first time they tried using a safety car in Formula 1 was way back in the 1973 Canadian Grand Prix. There was this gnarly crash between Francois Severt and Jody Scheckter, and they thought bringing out the safety car could help. Well, let's just say it didn't exactly go smoothly. They plonked the safety car right in the middle of the pack, causing utter chaos. Drivers took advantage of the confusion to climb positions, and it took hours after the race to figure out who finished where. After that mess, they steered clear of using the safety car for a good 20 years. Race organizers had other ways to handle dicey situations, like waving the red flag if things got hairy. But when they reintroduced in 1993, they got their act together. Now it's a regular feature of the races. No drama, no fuss, just keeping things safe and sound on the track. I can't believe number 10 is actually real. Talk about dangerous. Nowadays, there's a speed limit in the pit lane. Makes sense, right? It's a hive of activity with mechanics, team members, reporters and cameramen all buzzing around. They've got lines marking where F1 drivers got to stick to the speed limit when they're entering and exiting. But believe it or not, they didn't start testing this rule until 1993. It wasn't until after the tragic 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, where we lost Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna, that they decided to get serious about safety in Formula 1. So, among many other safety changes, they slapped on a speed limit in the pit lane. And over the years, they've made it stricter. These days, it's set at 60 km per hour. Nobody questions its use today, but back in the day, it was a whole different story. Drivers used to gun it in the pit lane, trying to change and warm up their tires as quick as they could. Number 11 takes us to the old sponsors. Today's Formula 1 is all about riding the same wave as other major sports worldwide. They're big on sustainability, efficiency, new tech, healthy living, you name it. Plus, they're all about zero alcohol and no tobacco. But guess what? It wasn't always like that. For ages, Formula 1 had this reputation for being all about the glitz, glamour and loads of cash. Booze and tobacco ads were plastered everywhere, especially the tobacco ones. With the arrival of sponsors in Formula 1 in the 1960s, the major tobacco companies jumped on board, sponsoring teams left and right. Formula 1 was like the ultimate spot to flaunt their brands with its global TV coverage and all that jazz. Thus, tobacco ads were very present in Formula 1 until 2006, when the FIA banned alcohol and tobacco ads. But let's not forget those big tobacco names like Camel, Gold Leaf, John Player Special and Marlboro. They gave us some seriously iconic team liveries and pumped in heaps of cash to make teams winners. It was a win-win really. Even though they got the boot in 2006 to keep up with the times, you can still spot major alcohol and tobacco companies hanging around Formula 1. They're just a bit more low-key now, pushing their zero alcohol drinks or electric cigarettes on the down low. It's all about subliminal advertising, dear. If you thought that was epic, you'll be speechless when you find out these moments in F1 that can't be repeated. What are you waiting for? Come on, click there.